Good evening, and I'd like to welcome everybody along to tonight's session. Tonight we do have David Broder, and he will be talking about the rise of Italian fascism. And as I said a few weeks ago, David has written and researched extensively on Italian politics. I inaccurately gave his location as Italy, but he's now in Berlin, but we'll pass that one over at the moment. So without much further ado, I'll hand over to David. The usual format is an opening contribution of around about half an hour to 45 minutes, and then we throw it open to questions and discussion. And comrades who were here last week remember that I did something of an introduction about some of the debates about fascism, and in particular, the ways that it might have had a certain continuity with movements in the 19th century, but also some of the debates about its sort of special or unique characteristics, and in particular looking at fascism across Europe. But that was only a very broad brush introduction, and I'm sure David will look in much more detail at Italy. So just before we begin, if comrades want to come in, could they please use the raise hand function? If you've got a problem with using raise hand, then you can put a question into the question and answer box. Please don't use the chat for questions, because it's actually very difficult for speakers and for me and for Tina, who's doing a lot of the technical work, to quite follow up. So please use the question and answer box if you can't use the raise hand, and I'll put the questions to David. So off we go. Okay, David?
Well, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to Kevin for the invite. So first, I'm going to talk a bit about why I think it's even worth studying like the history of Italian fascism and how it feeds into discussion of the far right or resurgent fascism today. Because obviously, with the rise of sort of populist or far right movements at the moment, either capturing old conservative parties or replacing their political space, we often hear talk of a resurgence of fascism, and the movements that actually call themselves fascists or openly identify with the past of the interwar regimes are in most cases not a particularly prominent element of this phenomenon. So parties like the Front National in Spain, or in some variants, people invoke things like Trumpism or even Brexit and so on as instances of this. In general, they're trying to draw a connection between historical fascism and right-wing movements that don't in any way identify with it. That said, there are also some cases where movements who do have historic roots in fascism have more or less successfully reinvented themselves. And a very good case study of that is in Italy itself, not with the Lega, but by the party called Brothers of Italy, led by Giorgia Meloni, which is currently polling around 20%, and it has its roots in the MSI, the party created by veterans of Mussolini's regime after 1945. Its leaders call themselves post-fascists, and they have reinvented themselves as part of what is seen as the sort of mainstream conservative so-called centre-right. So that party has, since the 1990s, reinvented itself with a sort of more explicitly sort of pro-EU, pro-NATO, even Christian democratic guise. While it's particularly strong at the moment, it has already been in government during the Silvio Berlusconi governments of the 1990s and 2000s. It has, in a way, moved on, no longer calls itself fascist, and yet a lot of its discourse and its obsessions are related to World War II, to attacking sort of anti-fascist elements of public discourse, assumptions in public life, and many of its cadres originally come from more militant or even terroristic fascist street movements. But politically, this is something a bit more like the former Francoite party in Spain, the Popular Party, the main conservative party there, or if we think of hard right parties in government in countries like Poland and Hungary. Apart from that, most populist and far right parties don't have which are achieving electoral success, don't have a similar genealogy in the interwar regimes or even the collaborationism of World War II in Europe. We've all seen people on Facebook and Twitter saying things like that, you know, Donald Trump or Farage or whatever are akin to fascism, and even in an apparently more sort of sober and less sort of hysterical level, there's also figures like, for example, the US historian and commentator Tim Snyder, who defined fascism almost precisely by the fact that it doesn't want to call itself its real name, sort of painting it as an evasive phenomenon that always kind of creeps up on us unawares and doesn't appear in the guise we'd expect. It's not going to arrive again with guns and black shirts and so on. So this is often portrayed as a kind of checklist of creeping developments, attacks on minorities, corporate power, assertive nationalism, appeals to religion, this kind of thing, which supposedly embody fascism on the rise. And when historians of fascism respond, arguing that actually the contemporary populist right is quite dissimilar to the interwar experience, particularly given the lack of paramilitary forces, the lack of a revolutionary threat from the left, the fact that these far-right parties, at least outwardly, accept some sort of democratic forms. This kind of argument is often met with the rebuke that really kind of being stuck in the history of the 1920s and 1930s is a failure to recognize the particular danger we represent now. So maybe these forces don't call themselves fascists, maybe they aren't full of you know, armed veterans in the way of the black shirt movement of the early 1920s in Italy, but even so, there is a fascistic logic and core to them, sort of adapted for postmodern conditions. In fact, this itself is a very old idea, dating back even to the 1930s and 40s. So George Orwell said that if fascism arrived in England, it would be of a more sedate and subtle kind, and presumably wouldn't even call itself fascist. He said that if fascism came to Britain, it wouldn't be through forces like Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists. Similarly, there's a quote often attributed to Sinclair Lewis, the US author, saying, when fascism comes to America, it will be wrapped in the flag and carrying a cross. So it wouldn't adopt the trappings of like the fascism that emerged in Germany and Italy, you know, sort of geopolitical enemies of the US. It would arrive in a more sort of national and less radical form. But I think that we can accept that these ideas have a kind of rational kernel, also taking seriously the differences between the fascism of the 1920s and the far right today, particularly in the sense that fascism doesn't emerge now and didn't then emerge in absolute separation from other bourgeois and reactionary forces. As the historian Zeev Sternhell put it, fascism wasn't born in the trenches in 1914, and it didn't die in a bunker in Berlin in 1945. Kevin referred to the sort of antecedents of fascism in the sort of revolutionary right of the late 19th century, something Sternhell always also talks about. But at the same time, even in the sort of classic Italian case, it came to power not just by besieging the existing elites and political institutions from the outside with something entirely new, but also by co-opting and integrating existing power structures. And this in turn shaped the fascist party's own internal dynamics. The fascist takeover between the end of World War I and the final consolidation of Mussolini's dictatorship in 1926 itself involved a kind of absorption process in which fascism, the movement, really was integrated into the constitutional framework of post-unification Italy, even as at the same time it destroyed the spaces of democracy and mass politics previously open to the workers' movement. The fact that Mussolini was initially brought to power by the established liberal and conservative factions in parliament, his first government formed in November 1922 only had 35 out of 535 MPs, but enjoyed a broad support among the parliamentary right, was itself testament to the way in which fascism and its rise relied on integration by existing elites. Even so, to properly understand fascism, we need to understand that far from obeying some sort of pre-established plan by capital, like as if capital were imagined as a kind of collective consciousness and project, or even by actors like the Employers Federation, Confindustria, or the King, or the previously dominant liberal politicians, or whatever, far from it being just instrumentally their tool for crushing the left, the story is much more about the way in which those ruling class forces essentially adapted to the mounting fascist movement and its takeover, rather than risk a civil war in which the revolutionary left might emerge victorious. So as I say, it's a story of integration and adaptation more than them just using fascism as a cudgel. This itself poses the question of whose interests fascism actually served, both in theory and in practice. And in part, this is connected to a well-established theme of historians' discussions of fascism, which is the distinction between fascism as a movement, the veterans movement that formed in the wake of World War I, and the ideas, the local hierarchs and so on that made that up. And then fascism as a regime in the sense of Mussolini's dictatorship under the monarchy, in alliance with the established institutions of Italy, in partnership, and indeed in a pact with the church, and this kind of thing. So the difference between what fascism claimed to be and then what it actually was in practice. In this sense, it's also useful to look at some of the contemporary analyses. And in particular, I'm going to mention an article by Antonio Gramsci, which he published in Pravda, the organ of the Soviet Communist Party, on 7th of November 1922. So just 7 days after Mussolini had been appointed prime minister. I also mentioned this article because it was actually sort of unknown to Italian historians until a couple of months ago, and was then rediscovered. Some of you might know I'm Europe editor at Jacobin, and we're going to be publishing this article in English in the next few days. So it's just a short piece that he wrote as a kind of immediate reaction to Mussolini becoming prime minister, but it includes some important points for understanding how the left reacted to the initial rise of fascism and understood it as a phenomenon. So one aspect of this is asserting that while Mussolini's appointment was a defeat, the situation wasn't particularly desperate for the Communist Party, in that it had already been pushed into clandestinity in 3/4 of Italy already. Already before sort of day one of Mussolini's spell as prime minister, the blackshirt movement up and down Italy, mainly formed of veterans, middle-class youths, students. It had killed since 1919, and particularly since the end of 1920, in that kind of 2-year period, let's say end of 1920 to end of 1922. It had killed a couple of thousand of worker activists, It had burnt down city halls and violently ousted socialist-led local councils. It had destroyed workers' and peasants' cooperatives, union branch offices, newspapers, and so on, almost exclusively with the acquiescence of the police and the sort of established forces of order. And it was through this mobilization to crush the left, particularly in the wake of the so-called two red years of 1919 to 20, the factory and land occupations that followed World War I. It was through that mobilization against the left and workers' movement, including importantly some peasants' organizations. It was through that fascism built itself up as a paramilitary force. So in this article, Gramsci was basically saying, well, Mussolini is prime minister now, but already we, the communists, we already have had to deal with its overwhelming force of arms. But the second, more decisive part of the article is that although fascism had been able to bring together its own social base in opposition to the apparent revolutionary threat in Italy, and built its sort of paramilitary movement on that basis, forged alliances with liberal and conservative politicians. Its own project was built on very contradictory interests, which were liable to push it to collapse. And again, Gramsci saw this as a reason not to think that the new regime would last. So he described the situation as follows. In Italy, a new period of history is beginning, which we can define as follows. Political power is passing from the hands of the capitalist bourgeoisie into the hands of the middling and big agrarian strata, the landowners, under the ideological guidance of part of the urban petty bourgeoisie. He continued, even for the bourgeoisie, it will be difficult to accept the harsh tyrannical domination by the landowners and the irresponsible demagogy of a mediocre adventurer like Mussolini. So there's a couple of things to note here which are useful for understanding the rise of fascism. First is the reference to the ideological guidance of part of the urban petty bourgeoisie. We might say more accurately, a layer also including white-collar workers, professionals, and notably students. It was they who constituted the initial intellectual core of the movement, who were the most inspired by its ideas of national regeneration, empire, a new hierarchy enforcing harmony among the classes. This was, of course, a worldview particularly shaped by World War I and Italy's, the particular outcome Italy had suffered while Italy was on the winning French-British side. It had suffered 500,000 deaths and made extremely limited territorial gains. So was in a sense one of the losers of the outcome of the war. Also in the sense that the shift from war production back to peacetime production immediately brought severe economic crisis. So you had hundreds of thousands of demobilized soldiers, basically all tooled up, often still armed, and with nowhere to go. So this helped create the kind of social base of the actual militants of the fascist movement, not the sort of electorate, but the actual cadres, the people who actually became black shirts and went around destroying the infrastructure of the labor movement. So it's important to understand that this project, although it was aimed against a revolutionary threat, it also came from outside of the existing institutions and in opposition, explicit opposition to the pre-war liberal elites. In fact, even apart from the movement that called itself fascist, we can see a similar phenomenon also in other kind of nationalist movements, veterans associations. Of course, a famous other instance of this kind of movement among demobilized soldiers is the attack at in autumn of 1919 in Fiume, which is a city now in Croatia known as Rijeka, where the poet Gabriele D'Annunzio led thousands of demobilized Italian soldiers to invade and occupy the city, which was in a sense sort of portended the rise of fascism, in that an extra institutional paramilitary force seized control of the city on behalf of the Italian state. And indeed not under Mussolini's leadership, but D'Annunzio's. At the same time, while this movement, this sort of urban fascist milieu, was largely a product of World War I, and actually quite middle class in its there's a large presence of students, white collar professionals, and so on. At the same time, its initial growth heavily relied on its backing from agrarian interests, who hired fascists as muscle to smash up farm worker organizing, to destroy peasant cooperatives and the institutions of reformist socialism, notably in regions of sort of northern central Italy like Emilia-Romagna. So this gave fascism a contradictory aspect, already alluded to in the Gramsci quote I cited, that it was an avowedly modernizing, regenerative movement, but it was most enthusiastically backed, at least at first, by the most backward sectors of capital, most reliant on crude repression to suppress wage demands. And this formed sort of a link between the interests of big landowners and then sort of the under pressure middle classes in the cities, who had also been terrified by the workers' movement that followed World War I, the Biennio Rosso, the two red years I mentioned. So Gramsci's analysis emphasized that while these agrarian interests relied on crudely repressing the peasants, and fascism had built its armed strength on this basis, that this wasn't the program of the industrial bourgeoisie, and that they wouldn't want to have to sort of accept the dictatorship of Mussolini. So in his reading, a few days after the March on Rome, he argued that there was going to be a conflict between landowner interests and then the more advanced sections of capital, more likely to seek some sort of reformist compromise with labor, rather than just to suppress the entire trade union movement. This also ought to be set in relation with a divide within the fascist movement itself, where Mussolini appeared to the existing elites as a figure who could channel the black shirt movement, his mobilized base, the paramilitaries and so on, that he could fix all that within constitutional limits, essentially to demobilize them. As I said, Mussolini was first appointed prime minister as part of a government based on a much wider coalition, including the liberals who dominated Italian parliamentary politics since the 1890s, notably the prime minister Giovanni Giolitti, as well as conservatives like Antonio Salandra, who'd been the prime minister during the early phases of World War I, and another nationalist paramilitary movement led by Luigi Federizzani, who was strongly backed by steel interests, the armaments industry, and so on. Basically, these figures thought that they could integrate Mussolini into the prime minister's office with a weak parliamentary base, and then use him to constrain the most radical elements of his own movement, which is widely identified with so-called agrarian fascism, as I say, the local level paramilitaries who were most purely organized for the purpose of suppressing farm workers. So indicative in this sense is an earlier article Gramsci had written in August 1921 called The Two Fascisms, counterposing the sort of more politicized, more urban, and more professional wing of fascism led by Mussolini, more prone to institutional compromise and so on, and then the more the squads which existed to mete out violence for its own sake, the hirelings of the landlords and so on. In August 1921, the Liberal Prime Minister Ivanoe Bonomi brokered a pact with Mussolini and the leadership of the Socialist Party agreeing that both sides would disarm in order to save Italy from the climate of mounting civil war. In reality, this was pretty one-sided. It basically served as a pretext for police to disarm the left and to carry out repression in the name of weapons searches and so on. Whereas local level black shirts rejected any kind of truce and continued their armed attacks. At the same time, the pact served to ban communists from serving in the police and armed forces, but not the black shirts, who were therefore sort of free to continue building their presence within the official repressive apparatuses. So in Gramsci's article, Two Fascisms, he postulated that basically while Mussolini and the Pacification Pact would lead part of his movement to be integrated into sort of normal, peaceful parliamentary politics through a coalition with the rest of the right, with the established liberal parties and so on, the agrarian paramilitaries wouldn't be able to accept this. As he wrote, the genuine fascism that the peasants and workers of Emilia Veneto and Tuscany know through their own painful experience will continue, perhaps under a different name. So again, here Gramsci saw a split within the fascist movement between its different souls. And even in the days after Mussolini became prime minister, he spoke of tensions between parts of the capitalist class and fascism. As I say, so while fascism had been united, had cohered as a movement to suppress the proletarian revolution, the fear of which was certainly widespread among the middle classes in 1919 to 20. So while in the wake of those red years, fascism had built its paramilitary strength, in this reading, in Gramsci's reading, this coalition was bound to come unstuck because of its lack of a sort of positive project of its own. Gramsci saw Mussolini as a mediocre adventurer. And even among the statements of employers representatives and liberal politicians from the time of the March on Rome, we often find this talk of a black Bolshevism, just as threatening as the red Bolshevism on the left. So at most, Mussolini's appointment was initially intended to pacify this threat, to disarm the black shirts, to move fascism within constitutional channels. So this prediction that fascism would be short-lived, which was certainly widespread at the time, relied on the sense that while the capitalists' interests led them to look favorably on repression against peasants and workers, ultimately a fascist dictatorship isn't the political form that best suits the development of capitalism. Of course, in reality, the fascist regime not only endured, but hardened. By 1926, fascism had not only succeeded in maintaining its coalition with pre-existing political elites, not only won over the support of the Employers' Federation and so on, but had actually marginalized any potential opposition and shut down the remnants of democratic forms, establishing a one-party dictatorship that called itself totalitarian. So this poses the question of how, if fascism wasn't the best solution for capitalism, if individual leaders of, so individual captains of industry, the Employers' Federation, the king and the ruling class figures around him, military leaders and so on, if all of them didn't want fascism or didn't see it as the best way of the best framework for capitalist development, how come it was able to cohere itself in power and strengthen itself? I don't say any of this in order to necessarily in order to criticize Gramsci for a particular lack of foresight. When he sort of proclaimed that fascism had contradictions that could be broken, obviously part of that was intended as a call to arms. The article I mentioned, published in Pravda on 7th of November 1922, actually appeared in an edition of the paper celebrating the 5th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. So from the perspective of its editors, couldn't have had a too downbeat tone. But nonetheless, I think what these articles tend to convey, which is quite common in many Marxist readings of fascism, is a tendency to exaggerate the idea of a kind of collective capitalist class project, a sort of pre-formed vision of where the capitalist class wants to go, which then draws it into conflict with the rival project of fascism and the limits which the regime imposed. Or rather, it underestimated Mussolini's ability to combine an ongoing offensive against the organized left and workers' movement with an integration of his movement into constitutional limits that could, if not necessarily always win the support, then at least confuse and pacify elements of the ruling class who might have moved against him before the regime consolidated. The ins and outs of that are extremely complicated, and the regime didn't fully cohere until the end of the 1920s, at least until the end of 1926, so 4 years after the March on Rome. Opposition parties still existed. In 1924, elections were held, and until the start of 1925, opposition MPs could still operate, could still sort of speak freely. They still had the parliamentary immunity and so on. To better understand the particular ins and outs, a really good book is Adrian Littleton's The Seizure of Power. But I'll cite one particular episode as kind of illustrative of the general dynamics I'm talking about, which is the events surrounding the general election held in April 1924, 18 months after Mussolini had first been appointed prime minister. He'd first been appointed prime minister with only 35 MPs out of 535. But in this election, marked by massive intimidation, ballot stuffing, but also the support of the main right-wing parties for Mussolini's coalition, his so-called national lists took about 2/3 of the vote, and his own party, the National Fascist Party itself, took just over half the seats in parliament. Already before the election, it had been widely speculated in media, but also this was an idea which the fascists themselves pushed, that really the election would mark the end of their sort of opportunity to stop the hardening of his regime, and thus there was a risk of some sort of coup against him or even an attempt to stop the election taking place. The last chance to oust Mussolini before he had a popular mandate, however confected. And after the election, several opposition figures did denounce the fraud, notably the reformist socialist MP Giacomo Matteotti. On 10th of June 1924, he went missing and was widely presumed to be murdered. And this did produce a crisis within Mussolini's cabinet between the fascists and then the other liberal and conservative elements within it. In this case, he had been seen to fail to rein in the street violence, which had been spread by his own base. And as a result, a week later, the chief of police who he had appointed, who had also been responsible for integrating fascist paramilitaries into the normal sort of state policing structures and so on, the chief of police was forced to resign. And then another week later, the left-wing parties, as well as the Popular Party, which is like Christian Democrats, the party supported by the church, and some liberals, they collectively quit Parliament in what's called the Aventine Secession. So the idea was basically to delegitimize the fascist-dominated Parliament and put pressure on the king to dismiss Mussolini. The strength and limit of this project was its appeal to moral outrage and the sense that Mussolini or the fascists had gone too far. This also led to a sort of brief opening up of more strident criticism of Mussolini within the press, and Mussolini was forced to reshuffle his cabinet to give other conservative figures greater power. So this was also a sort of sign of penitence, and that he remained committed to the existing institutions. The opposition parties, who sort of met up separately, proclaiming themselves a counter parliament, their problem was that they essentially relied on the king to act on their behalf, or at least for other figures close to the regime to back away from it, to isolate it, to abandon it. There were some proposals to do things like forcibly arrest Mussolini, to mount some sort of coup, or to form a alternative government which the king could then turn to. But these were thwarted by the fact that the more reformist elements, but in particular the Popular Party, the Christian Democrats, didn't want to transgress legal and constitutional limits in order to unseat Mussolini's government. But in particular, the Pope exerted pressure on the Popular Party against forming a government with even reformist socialists. And when, for instance, the communists advocated that the opposition called a general strike against the Mussolini dictatorship, the other opposition parties all rejected this. In fact, already in July 1922, before the March on Rome, when the unions and the left had called a general strike to defend legality, to defend law and order, this actually had the effect of frightening the sort of established liberal figures of institutional Italy, and hastened their initial coalition with Mussolini. And again, in summer 1924, this spectre of conflict again actually served to weld the Employers' Federation and the king to Mussolini, basically because they feared the power vacuum if he were toppled, an open contest for power in which the revolutionary left might regain strength more than him staying in place. So ultimately, it was Mussolini who instead moved against them and brought the crisis to a head. And as he permanently banned, he revoked the parliamentary mandates of the MPs who had quit Parliament. And so this, at the start of January 1925, was the effective beginning of the one-party state. And then at the end of 1926, there were specific laws to dissolve the opposition parties. So to understand why fascism moved from being one party in a coalition government to a well-established regime, we need to look also at conjunctural moments like this and the reasons why forces within the existing institutions, why the organizations of the capitalist class didn't act against fascism. They acquiesced and they preferred to allow it to continue developing its dictatorship rather than risk any sort of moment of conflict. But another factor decisive for this was the fundamentally unrevolutionary character of fascism itself, in particular in terms of the institutions of the economy and the labor market. Mussolini wasn't simply an adventurer or even a representative of the fascist social base own interests. And we particularly see this in the economic choices of his regime and obedience to the fundamental doctrines of so-called liberismo, which means something a bit like free market, but in particular sort of sound money, the gold standard, fiscal restraint, this kind of thing, which really succeeded in dulling any doubts that fascism did actually represent a threat to big capital, as it said. In the sort of orthodox sort of communist international reading of fascism expressed by Georgy Dimitrov, this would be expressed as the idea that fascism is the open dictatorship of the elements most linked to finance capital. And there's an element of truth in this. So from 1922 to 1925, the finance minister, Alberto Di Stefani, was like a laissez-faire liberal from a centrist party who used Mussolini's full powers to carry through a kind of slimming of the state bureaucracy, tax cuts, some privatizations of state-owned enterprises, and so on. While some fascist hierarchs, like Giuseppe Bottai, did draw on syndicalist ideas about reorganizing the economy, and they outlined these plans for so-called corporatism. So like the idea is like rather than an employers federation and a workers trade union, you have a single state-run union which forces them together, which supposedly combines their interests. But while there was some sort of reluctance from Employers Federation to accept this kind of instrument, in practice, because the so-called workers' side, the fascist unions for workers, because they were, of course, totally purged of any kind of leftist militants, they weren't allowed to organize within workplaces. In practice, they were means of organizing. Sort of fascist regime granted welfare and insurance benefits for workers and didn't challenge the domination by private capital in any way. And instead, we see these so-called corporations, the unions of employers and workers, are, if anything, like a way in which the state and the fascist regime coordinates private capital, but kind of on its behalf and in agreement with it, rather than any kind of confrontational way. Quite indicative in this sense is that the currency reform by Mussolini in 24, as well as measures like which devalued the currency, sorry, revalued the currency, made it more expensive, and tax breaks encouraging mergers among firms. So firstly, like the effects of the slump, the effects of the currency reform, tax breaks for mergers, basically hit small capitalists, destroyed through dead wood, and merged companies into larger units, like the idea of kind of national champions, like this or that company, which will be like the big Italian private steel maker or whatever. And this was the basis of so-called autarky, that Italy would so independently build up its own industries through a more sort of organized capitalism. In no way was this a collectivist or even nationalizing project. Moreover, the slump conditions of the early 1920s, the massive emigration and blacklisting of worker militants allowed a massive reassertion of the power of private capital, pushing down wages. So the point of all that is, while the fascist movement wasn't simply the creation of capitalist interests and often threatened to outflank them, destroyed the political forms which the capitalist class had traditionally relied on, its sort of collectivist and revolutionary promises weren't the threat that might have been thought. And the industrial bourgeoisie, its interests were at least compatible with the fascist dictatorship. It was able to fill a power vacuum which other bourgeois forces could not. In particular, in the age of sort of mass politics, which had begun in Italy, particularly with the introduction of universal suffrage in 1912, the old like liberal and conservative parties had never really created a mass base. They were parliamentary factions whose politics was very much centered on kind of horse trading, sort of corrupt exchange between the central government and sort of local representatives. And fascism was so while the Socialist Party was a genuinely mass political force, and so what fascism specifically offered in this sense was a fighting force that was able to mobilize and crush the left in a way that small parliamentary factions couldn't have done. But then, in turn, overwhelmed also the liberal parliamentary forces themselves. At moments of crisis, whether from the general strike for legality in July 1922, the March on Rome, the killing of Matteotti, the most powerful industrial and institutional interests always preferred to avoid confrontation with fascism, and this allowed it to strengthen its grip. In those cases, ruling class appeasement of fascism, obviously a key factor in that was its fear of the revolutionary left, not only based on the real organization of the socialist and communist parties, or of land occupations or factory occupations, but also a much more diffuse sort of sense of revolutionary threat stemming from the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And this mindset, this threat persisted well beyond the initial sort of post-war I workers' revolt. I mean, there's a famous quote by the anarchist Enrico Malatesta, which was basically kind of, if we don't carry through the revolution now, then the terrified bourgeoisie will be punishing us for years. And in particular, as I mentioned with the episodes in the killing of Matteotti, above all, the ruling class feared a kind of collapse into civil war or instability without a clear outcome. And in that sense, Mussolini did at least represent a stabilizing force who could be expected to maintain order. This also helps explain how come 20 years later, in 1943, once Allied forces started arriving in Sicily, once the Allies bombed Rome in July 1943, the monarchy, the ruling class figures immediately abandoned Mussolini, because they realized that only by so doing could they save the state and their own power from some sort of civil war or revolutionary overthrow. Very interesting in that sense also are the exchanges between Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt in the days of Mussolini's downfall in July 1943, terrified by exactly this threat, which is that 20 years of, in Churchill's words, 20 years of fascism have destroyed the middle classes, and now the only alternative is Bolshevism. Which is also why figures from the fascist regime, like General Badoglio, were used to head the sort of transitional governments that turned Italy away from the alliance with Berlin and towards the Western allies. Okay. So the picture I've talked about is based on a situation without, where in the years before fascism took power, there weren't deep-rooted democratic institutions. The main ruling class parties were narrow parliamentary factions. There was diffuse social violence. There were hundreds of thousands of demobilized soldiers after the war, and so on. And of course, all of these things don't exist today, which poses the question of whether something like fascism could exist now, or even in a different name or a different guise or whatever. And certainly in the events surrounding the Capitol Hill riot, despite talk of returning fascism, I think we saw that the bar such forces would have to overcome, the obstacles to such a takeover are much greater. Broadly speaking, the US intelligence and defense establishment didn't support Trump's leadership, and upon the Capitol Hill riot, they all but removed him from office. There is, of course, great social instability in the United States compared to recent decades, with its declining hegemony as a global power, the 2008 financial crisis, now the pandemic. But also there are well-organized and strategically led parts of the US ruling class and state apparatus, which, faced with Trump, recognize that an attempt to form a dictatorship or even some sort of electoral college manipulation to keep him in office are more likely to damage US leadership, more likely to cause enduring instability, to tear apart the existing constitutional order than something like Biden's administration was. From their perspective, he's far more able to guarantee order, stability, appease enough of the population to avoid chaos and so on. Trump flattered fascist paramilitary groups, all the stuff about the good people on both sides in the Charlottesville, and also at the same time, obviously the Capitol Hill riot had elements of a sort of inside job allowing the protesters to enter. But the difference with the historic examples of fascism is that those forces, those paramilitaries, militias, these little fascist groups, they don't yet have any kind of, they don't have a strength of their own. They're not a threat to institutions that would make Trump some sort of desirable mediator figure. Whereas, back in the Italian example, Mussolini promised to take a large and dangerous paramilitary movement and channel it into institutional politics. Trump couldn't have played a similar role. I think we can see the same as well in France, where you see parts of the repressive state apparatus, which have been emboldened by governments in recent decades, are themselves becoming more assertive. People might have seen a few weeks ago the article in Valeurs Actuelles. It's a far-right magazine by retired generals and later signed by 1,000 active military personnel, saying that basically Macron is presiding over chaos, and if he doesn't restore order, they will. I think we should see this not as a real threat of a coup d'etat, but rather as helping to create a climate of chaos and perceived threat, in which Marine Le Pen appears as a sort of force for order and becomes a sort of more realistic governmental alternative. When I say that, when I draw those distinctions from the Italian case, my point isn't that, well, back then there were not reliable safeguards for liberal democracy, whereas now there are, because we could rely on like the CIA to defend democracy on our behalf. I'm not saying that at all, quite the opposite. Rather, the risk today is that in conditions in which capitalism is swinging from crisis to crisis and the working class lacks organizations of its own, which ever more atomized, fragmented, politically incoherent, a process of mounting authoritarianism is happening anyway, even without fascist parties, and perhaps even in the name of crushing twin extremisms of right and left. So we've seen this with the recent US anti-terrorist guidance aimed at Antifa as well as and socialists as well as fascists. We've seen in 2019 in the European Parliament a motion which condemns both totalitarianisms, left and right. And now in Italy, the party I mentioned at the start, Brothers of Italy, led by Giorgia Meloni, which together with the Lega is polling, those parties are polling more than 40% of the vote ahead of the 2023 election. They have a motion in Parliament which is to criminalize apologia for communism. So in a country where only 30 years ago there was a communist party of almost 2 million members, where communists and socialists took part in writing the post-war constitution, it could in fact be unconstitutional to apologize, to give in the sense of defend or justify communism. And we can imagine how widely that kind of legislation would be used against all sorts of leftist targets. Also in countries like Brazil, we see the way in which even, and I think it's something Richard Seymour's spoken about eloquently, is even in the absence of a strong organized left, the anti-communist offensive is actually intensifying. Again, look at countries like Hungary, Ukraine, and so on. So I think today we certainly shouldn't expect something like a fascist dictatorship harking back to the interwar years, also because contemporary far-right forces have no need to associate themselves with that experience and indeed openly distance themselves from it. But what the dominant ruling class forces certainly will allow is attacks on our democratic space like these. And to resist them, it won't be enough to say that the people promoting them are fascists, or to appeal to liberal-minded ruling class figures to protect the rule of law and so democratic spaces have been won in the past through organization, ultimately through force. And I think that we need to be well aware that no one is going to defend those spaces on our behalf. So I think, faced with the contemporary authoritarianism, the contemporary anti-communist right, and so on, it's important to recognize that mere anti-fascism or calling our opponents fascists isn't going to be enough. We need the strength of our own alternative, or we're going to remain very broken and crushed.
Okay, thanks very much, David. A very interesting and wide-ranging survey. I've got a number of comrades who want to come in and give you a bit of a rest. So over to you, Pat.
I can't hear
you. You need to unmute, Pat. Sorry.
You're still muted, Pat.
Take out your headphones, maybe.
Yes, take off the headphones. That might unplug them. That sometimes works. No, sorry. We might. No, sorry, comrade. We might have to try somebody else first.
Okay. I'll bring in Steve. Tom Bimpson next.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah,
yes.
We can, Tom. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much for that, David. It's a few decades since I read about Italian fascism fairly extensively. So thank you for reminding me about everything I'd forgotten. Thank you for an analysis which has told me things I didn't even know. And I think I'm probably going to have to read Gramsci again. My personal interest, in fact, and this question may have been brought up in an earlier emission, I don't know, is actually, in fact, with National Socialism in Germany, and that is over anti-Semitism, persecution of Jews, the final solution, and Zionism. Now, if you read Hitler's Mein Kampf, published in '26, and I have, it's clear that anti-Semitism is central to the political philosophy of National Socialism and also to the political economy of National Socialism. So the question I want to ask is, did it play any role at all in Italian fascism?
Okay, thanks, Tom. I'm going to call in Steve Freeman, and then we'll try and get Pat back again. Okay, Steve.
I've got this. I'm muting myself.
Yeah, we can hear you with
okay.
the headphones as well.
Right, even better still. Sorry. Hi, David. How are you doing? All right.
Yeah,
good. Thank you for that. Unfortunately, I had to go off for about 5 minutes in the middle of your talk. So what I'm going to now ask you a question about or make a comment on, you may have covered in the time I wasn't there. So we'll see. But one of the things I was thinking of asking you before missing out this space in your talk was to, but it goes with, I think, what your basic thesis is that the big factor in this is the Russian Revolution. And that what makes fascism have this rather peculiar character was the fact of the Russian Revolution that terrified the ruling classes and made them feel particularly scared all over Europe at that time. And so in a way, it's almost like the Russian counter-revolution taking place in Italy almost. I mean, that's a slight exaggeration to say that, but in other words, as well as the communist movement in Italy and the workers' strikes and all those other reactions to those things, the war itself is a point that you made already about veterans. So you had this trained section of the population that had been at war anyway, so they would be ready to go into the black shirts and all the rest of it. But I think that this, and it applies to Germany as well, I think what was going on in Germany in the 20s and into the 30s is also a response to the Russian Revolution and the revolutionary crisis at the end of the First World War. So when we talk, as you said towards the end, we don't have anything like that today. There's nothing of that type threatening the ruling class. And therefore, what we might say today is fascism, whatever it is, doesn't have that character of having to respond to what seemed to be a major working class threat, not only obviously just in Italy, but actually on a more European scale. Secondly, second point was this, that one can talk about a crisis of democracy existing, and that in that crisis of democracy, because the system of liberal parliamentary democracy is not working, and that then polarizes people either towards a more authoritarian type of government or to some greater democracy. In this particular case, unlike the Weimar Republic, you've got a king involved. Now, I saw it argued somewhere that when you've got a king, you can't really have fascism because it challenges the position of the monarchy. Because if you have somebody like Mussolini, the king has either got to cooperate with Mussolini and keep him in place or get rid of him. You know, at the end of the day, that's got to happen. If the king doesn't get rid of him, then it's the end of the constitutional monarchy. That's really what happened in Italy eventually. It was the end of the monarchy. But the king obviously has a role there that possibly doesn't happen in Germany, in the Weimar Republic, although you might argue the president played the same role as a facilitator of the whole thing anyway. So I think the form of government is another factor in this, and how a democratic movement in Italy, an anti-fascist democratic movement in Italy has to take account of the fact that Italy was a constitutional monarchy with a constitution, as you mentioned before, going right the way back to the resort, you know, to what happened in the 1860s and so on and so forth. So two things then: Russian Revolution and constitutional monarchy.
Okay, thanks.
Crisis of democracy. Right.
Thanks, Steve. I'll bring in Ed Bober now. Ed.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks ever so much, David, for your introduction, which was very informative. There's really just two questions I have. One is, can you say more about what sort of preceded the previous speaker mentioned the huge significance of the Russian Revolution that was sort of like a giant storm threatening the whole of the capitalist system in Europe, following 1917, the seizure of the power by the Bolsheviks. And as I understand it, from my limited knowledge of Italian history, it did have a very big effect in shaking up the workers' movement in Italy immediately after the First World War, with the Communist Party and the anarchists becoming very, very influential amongst the trade unions and the organized workers, and the Socialist Party quite rapidly losing its position amongst those layers of organized workers, with the scope, perhaps, and I'd like you to comment on this, that could it have been possible prior to Mussolini's arrival in power that the Communist Party in Italy could have actually taken power in the same way as the Bolsheviks took power in 1917 in Russia? That's my first question, and it's genuinely a question because I don't know enough about it. But it's like, you know, in a time of crisis, quite often it seems historically that the left has an opportunity, and it's only when that opportunity is lost that fascism or the far right get the chance to sort of come in as a way of stabilizing the situation in the interests of the ruling class. The other question is about Gramsci's role in the writing of this history. I know Gramsci is often cited, often quoted, and was obviously played a very important part in the development of the workers' movement in Italy. But he was in prison for a very long time, and most of what he's well known for now is what he wrote in prison. Can you tell me any more why he has such great significance in the annals of socialist historians? Why is he revered, in fact, by many on the left, and read and studied even by more. Can you just comment on that? Thanks very much, David.
Okay, thanks, Ed. If you'd like to come back now, David.
Yes, I'm just briefly going to plug in my laptop because. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't realize I was low. Yes, so thanks for the questions. Yes. Yes, so firstly, Tom, was it the question about anti-Semitism? In the initial phases of the fascist movement up to the seizure of power, deep into the 1930s, in fact, Italian fascism had no specific interest in anti-Semitism. There were anti-Semitic figures and journals and so on. There were also very prominent Jews who were fascists in Italy. Often this has been used by, I mean, there's a very commonplace idea in sort of even very mainstream right-wing Italian politics, which is kind of like the Mussolini dictatorship wasn't really that bad, but then having got mixed up with Hitler, it was radicalized, or it went down a dangerous course to disaster and defeat in World War II. Often, actually, this also though includes denying the specific role that Italy did play in the Holocaust, kind of claims that Mussolini sought to protect Jews and so on, which is not true. But I think that it's also important not to just see the anti-Semitism as purely as a German import, although it's certainly a strong influence. Also in the sense that when we look at the, basically also because I think it's important to root the specifics of fascist racism in a sort of wider history of European colonialism. In particular because although right from the outset, the regime talks about race, but often actually in a way which is quite common also in sort of reactionary thought, even in liberal democracies, sort of in terms of like vigor and regeneration and so on, rather than necessarily kind of erasing or eliminating tiny ethnic minorities. But the moment when the regime really turns to obsess about race is the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. And that's when the regime also becomes very interested in anti-Semitism and the whiteness of Italians, and so-called Aryan Italians and the Latin peoples and so on, as opposed to Jews and Africans and so on. And then we have in 1938, so we have things like there's a journal sponsored by the regime called The Defense of the Race, which is into measuring foreheads and this kind of stuff. But also in 1938, there's the so-called racial laws, which ban Jews from public service, whatever, like working in school or the civil service or anything, and also ban mixed race marriages. So yeah, I mean, I think that in that sense, the anti-Semitism develops quite late in the regime, but it's also part of a wider shift towards racial discourse, which is partly connected to the empire in Africa and so on as well. In post-war decades, particularly from the 1960s, 1970s, post-fascist movements would tend to distance themselves from that, at least in their sort of public-facing guise, either, as I said earlier, by the kind of myth that, oh, well, actually Mussolini did defend the Jews, or else with strong support for Israel and that kind of thing. And certainly today, parties like Meloni's Brothers of Italy are some of the most rabid defenders of the likes of Netanyahu and so on that there are. On Steve's points, I'll partly combine it with Ed's point of the Russian Revolution. I mean, the Russian Revolution had an extremely important echo in Italy, also because Italy was a country which already in spring 1917, sort of in the wake of the February Revolution in Turin, there was strikes and rioting, and an anti-war movement stronger than elsewhere in Europe. There's a kind of famous scene where like Menshevik representatives kind of come and visit Italy, and they visit Turin, all the crowd are shouting Lenin's name and that kind of thing. And a lot of the imagery and identity of the Italian left in the immediate post-World War I landscape is very drawn from Russian example. Italy is the only country where the Socialist Party, the sort of main workers' party, like, I mean, if we think of like, you know, the Labour Party or the SPD in Germany or the French Socialists or whatever, Italy is the only one where the Socialist Party of that type joined up to the Communist International upon its founding at the start of 1919. It had a very ambiguous position on World War I, which had been the main sort of split issue in the second Socialist International, and almost all of the leaders of the Socialist Party overtly, at least, supported the Russian Revolution. And I think that a great weakness of that party was effectively that it used the language of wanting to do something like the Russian Revolution in Italy without any kind of real follow through or seriousness. And part of the reason for the creation of the Communist Party was to split away from the socialists when faced with the land occupations, the factory occupations, the massive strikes of 1919 to 20. The Socialist Party basically remained committed to an almost purely electoral path to socialism. So you have figures even who outwardly were strong supporters of the Russian Revolution, like Giacinto Cerati, who was leader of the so-called Maximalists, and who later who didn't join the communist split. They had ideas kind of like, well, what we need to do is to win a majority in parliament, and then we will legislate in parliament to create Soviets. Or let's win over local councils, and then we'll turn them into one of them into Soviet as like a model. And I think that the basic problem of the Italian Socialist Party in relating to the Russian experience was because it hadn't had its own sort of 1905, because it hadn't had to fight for it hadn't had to fight for universal suffrage. Really, it had been granted by a liberal government in 1912. It wasn't really kind of hardened or serious enough to confront the situation following World War I. Italy, as I said, has a somewhat ambiguous position as neither exactly a winner or a loser of World War I. But if we think of other countries like, where there was some sort of state collapse and socialist parties who armed themselves and bid for power, like obviously Russia, also Hungary, the Italian situation wasn't quite like that. But also there was a lack of even of kind of serious reformist forces committed to defending democratic institutions. It partly relates to Steve's other point about republicanism and the monarchy, because no part of the Italian left saw the institutions of the Italian state as sort of their own, in the way that if we take the German SPD, okay, it played a counter-revolutionary role in the moment of the Spartacus uprising and the killing of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. It sought to channel the diffuse and sometimes chaotic revolutionary movement into the creation of the Weimar Republic. But it nonetheless did see the Weimar Republic as its own and did seriously defend it. When there was the so-called Kapp Putsch, the social by far-right army officers, the SPD-led government called general strike. The sort of whatever parliamentary institutional face of the party called out its own mass support and successfully defeated the putsch attempt. And part of the reason for the sinking into fascism in Italy was that the Socialist Party was kind of caught in between two stools, in the sense that it was neither a serious revolutionary movement actually prepared to bid for power, but nor was it integrated enough into the existing state as to be able to kind of block with other forces to defend democratic institutions from fascism. And I think its misleadership greatly contributed to the overall situation, and the communist split at the start of 1921 actually happened kind of after the some moment of mass mobilization and breakthrough had already happened. In fact, I think while the Communist Party is very often remembered for the fact as a party which didn't fight fascism, for being sort of sectarian and not willing to ally with other anti-fascists and so on. There's elements of truth to that, but really the main factor behind that was the Communist Party realized that it had to become an armed party. It had to be a force that would be able to, faced with fascism, not just sort of turn the other cheek or appeal to the defense of existing institutions and so on, but actually arm and equip and train its members to deal with a rising, expanding force, the fascists, whose members had recent experience of World War I. And it certainly didn't do enough to be able to, and wasn't strong enough to be able to confront that fascist threat. But I think for there to have been a revolution in Italy, the entire dimension of armed struggle would have had to have been taken much more seriously. As I said, though, I think a big part of the problem relies on the fact that the kind of political clarification that would have made the socialists into something like a revolutionary party hadn't happened before, and they failed to take the initiative at the moment of the workers' movement, the strikes and so on I mentioned were on the rise. And I think also in that sense it's interesting that while fascism certainly profited from a climate of bourgeois fear at the Bolshevik kind of spectre, that doesn't mean to say that you can just narrowly say it was created to defeat the revolutionary threat. It gained strength, it mobilized, it crushed the workers' movement after the movement was already in decline, after the workers' movement was already in decline, after the 2 red years so-called were already over. I think also, of course, all European countries, the spectre of the Bolshevik Revolution existed everywhere. But Italy was a case where the existing liberal parties were particularly poorly placed to offer any kind of reformist compromises or concessions, and also because the effects of turning from military to peace production were particularly bad. So there's kind of space for concessions to the workers' movement, the space for kind of reformist solutions wasn't really there. So that's a roundabout way of saying I think the kind of preparation, the political preparation wasn't there to build a revolutionary movement, even when there was the factory occupations and so on. There was nothing to link the movement in the cities to what was going on in the countryside. The number of participants in factory occupations was quite small, and the industrial working class only like 10–15% of the overall population. And the Socialist Party was very much a kind of loose regroupment of local branches, which also hampered it from fighting fascism seriously, basically because the fascists were very strong at mobilizing military force from different towns and concentrating them all on one point. Like if if there was a socialist-led local council, fascists would choose a day and bring in armed groups, mobile units from all over that region and attack it. And they were a much more effective force, whereas the socialists were hobbled by kind of localist ideology and so on. On Gramsci, I think I think there's reasons good and bad for taking interest in Gramsci. I think part of his appeal in academia and a certain type of kind of social democratic politics like if you read The New Statesman or so on, Gramsci is often kind of presented as a kind of almost a kind of post-Marxist ideologue, one who'd sort of as an alternative to Leninism, but also, there's a kind of way of casting him as a sort of champion of cross-class alliances, of reformism, a very kind of like loose and watered down ideas of ideas like hegemony and common sense just being used as so many ways to adapt to the dominant hegemony and common sense, while sort of denying that he was indeed a communist, which is also why, in the experience of Marxism today in the 80s, some of the intellectual antecedents of Blairism drew heavily on Gramsci in that particular vein. Partly that's helped along by the fact that because Gramsci was in prison from 1926 onwards, he was somehow sort of absent from the direct political fray. In the prison notebooks, he wasn't really commenting on contemporary political events. The references to also, even within the communist movement, the references to the kind of Stalin-Trotsky divide and so on, or more than the divide, confrontation, are very kind of elusive. And so the fact that the prison notebooks are themselves written under conditions of fascist censorship and have a certain timeless quality because they're a very expansive, so historical, philosophical reflection, means that they can be read almost as I said, as a sort of timeless document, or as if they were like not really affected or embroiled in the real choices and splits of the communist movement at the time, which in turn means that anyone can project onto Gramsci kind of a bit of what they like. There's something similar, I think, in the figure of Rosa Luxemburg, in the sense that she died so early in the development of the like post-war communist movement, but also because she was like something of a critic of Leninism and so on, that she becomes almost a kind of consensual figure onto which people can project very kind of generic ideas of free thinking and democracy and so on, while not taking her revolutionary thought seriously. Nonetheless, I think if you do actually study Gramsci, not as a monument or a saint, but or as just kind of generic Democrat, but if you study him in connection to the development of the Italian left in the period of his life, I think there's a lot in there. At the same time, though, about the specific problems of like strategy for the left in the West. That said, though, I kind of think that often that comes at the expense of kind of ignoring the other figures of the Italian left who also have a lot to say and are not translated or even heard of. That's why I'm a historian of the Italian left. I'll come out with some stuff to read, which hopefully will be good. I think that's my answer to those questions.
Okay, thanks, David. I think we can get Pat back now. So if you'd like to come in, Pat.
Still can't hear you, Pat.
You're silent again.
It doesn't work, Pat. We can't hear you. Oh dear. Sorry.
Okay. I've got a couple of questions in the question box, David. One which I think is probably quite widely, people are quite widely interested. Certainly, it was a point made when I was much younger, and that's about the role of the Catholic Church in the promotion of fascism. And I suppose one of the things that was quite popular, particularly in this country, was the association of reactionary Catholic politics in Italy and Spain, Portugal, and so on. And they were often seen as sort of Catholic movements. That doesn't quite fit so well with Nazism, I think. And then the second question is from Liv Singh. And Liv says, and I think you touched on this, but I still think it's perhaps an interesting area to go into. Why didn't the communists in the working class movement form paramilitary units to challenge the fascists on the street? And again, the comparisons with other countries where there were physical confrontations to stop the rise of the fascists, I think is an interesting question. I can't see any other comrades with their hands up at the moment. I've got a question, so I'll just use up my position, and it really follows on from what you last talked about in terms of Gramsci, and maybe your earlier references to the way that sections of the Italian right sort of say that Mussolini wasn't so bad. And I wondered if you could tell us more about the debate in Italy. I think one of the problems that socialists in other countries, particularly I think in Britain, is that the way that the fascist experience is sort of understood. And in Britain, because of course it's very different history, it's sort of seen as the form of other countries. But how important is the debate now, both on the left and in what we might think of as mainstream right politics about fascism? Is there some sort of re-evaluation? And particularly in view of what you said towards the end about the way that the authoritarian position now comes from the state and indeed comes from quite established capitalist parties, I wonder if you could perhaps link your remarks into that. I see that Pat is still there, but I wonder if we can get him in. And can you speak, Pat? No, there's still nothing coming out. Okay, are there any further comrades who want to speak? Pat, I don't think we can get you at all.
Well, you asked Pat to write his question.
Yeah, Pat, could you write it, or is it a long contribution? It's just, yeah.
I'll respond to the others and maybe you can write it.
Yes, if you would. Thanks, David.
Yeah, okay, so the Catholic issue. I mentioned this party called the Popular Party. It's basically the same party that was the Christian Democrats after World War II. And as in the name of that party, it was the party of Catholic Italy, and which isn't just a conservative or sort of ruling class party, but also has very strong elements of peasant support and even kind of Catholic workers. And of course, I mean, Italy until 1945 was a massively peasant country. It was very poor as well. I mean, if we're talking about like in the 20s, like Italy was closer to the GDP of like the Soviet Union or Argentina or something than like Britain or France or Germany. It's very undeveloped. And the Catholics party was very strongly rooted, also because it had things like the so-called white peasant leagues, so white Catholic as opposed to red communist and socialist. And those movements weren't purely like reactionary or intended to undermine socialist organization. And there were sort of leftish figures within the Popular Party. So in fact, I mentioned the the strike for legality, the strike to defend civil liberties in July 1922. And that was actually in reaction against a raid on the home of a Popular Party MP, Guido Miglioli, who was like a peasant organizer and was like a leftish Catholic. And, you know, there's obviously even most, you know, of course, the mere fact of being sort of Catholic, either believing or identity or whatever, didn't mean that people weren't also socialists or communists. But the overall behavior of the party was mainly governed by the church, in particularly under Pope Pius. And as I mentioned earlier, who was also the Pope during World War II and effectively supported well, more or less supported the German occupation. In fact, I was doing some research. I think this hasn't been published. I was in the National Archives in Kew in West London. I was reading like the dispatches from Rome during the German occupation of 1943, 1944. And basically, so the dispatches from the British ambassador to the Vatican. And basically what all of them are about is that the Pope wants there to be a transfer of power from the Germans and fascists to the Allies without there being any kind of uprising or tumult or whatever. And part of this is also that he requests via the British ambassador that when the Allied troops do their victory march through the city, so they basically arrange for a peaceful transfer, the Vatican did. So he arranges that the Pope insists that when the Allied troops march through the city, no black troops should be allowed to participate. But the ambassador specifies this was not due to any racialist prejudice on the Pope's part, but solely for concerns of public order. During the initial rise of the fascist regime, the Popular Party, basically the church hierarchy, opposed them making any kind of pact with reformist socialists, any kind of centrist combinations involving so-called materialist forces. And in 1924, they opposed the resistance to the regime, to the fascist government after the killing of Giacomo Matteotti. The church had very poor relations with the post-unification Italian state because when it was founded, it had destroyed the remnants of the papal state. But in 1929, Mussolini arranged the so-called Lateran Pacts, which was like a concordat in which the church was given a kind of semi-official status and was given like the Vatican City, its property was guaranteed and to be like non-taxed, its control of schools and so on. And that basically pacified the church. A quite interesting phenomenon going on right now actually is that the government is, there's a bill in Parliament against anti-LGBT discrimination. And the church, and indeed, despite his apparent liberalism, Pope Francis have complained that this ban on LGBT discrimination would actually contravene the terms of the pact the church signed with Mussolini in 1929. Then, I mean, I'm not sure there was anything else I wanted to say about the Catholic Church specifically. Oh, I mean, the fascist movement had in its origins had a strong anti-clerical element, and you know was also kind of Republican openly at the origin. Among fascist circles, there's this kind of idea, you know, sort of nostalgic post-war fascists. There's this kind of idea which is like the real fascism never fully came to bear, was never really seen in practice, if not in the moment of the German occupation. Because until 43, it was always constrained by its alliance with the church and with the monarchy. So a certain kind of idea of fascism as, you know, kind of futurist-oriented, modernist movement and so on. Some would say that sort of limited it from realizing its potential. Yes, so the question of why didn't the communists organize paramilitaries? Part of the answer is that they did, but within the very limited sort of firepower. The communists had an organization called Ufficio Uno, like Office One, like their illegal underground network. They did have kind of several thousand armed members. They got some weapons also from like the sort of spillover of the Hungarian and German revolutions. A really interesting figure, Francesco Misiano. He was a communist MP who had fought in the Spartacus uprising in Berlin in January 1919. He was arrested during the siege of the Vorwärts office, the office of the Social Democrats. I was in jail in Berlin for a year. When he came back in early 1920, he was insisting that the Italian Socialist Party had to get real about armed organization and preparing for a civil war. And I think in the and again that basically was ignored, and then the Communist Party so somewhat took up that agenda. There was also a movement separate from the party, but involving a lot of its militants, called Arditi del Popolo. So Arditi is a type of World War I soldier. Often it's translated as shock troops, and that movement was very diffuse. It had veterans groups. And part of it was called the Arditi del Popolo, founded in June 1921. A lot of the leaders were anarchists or sort of republicans. And it had at its peak about 20,000 members, although it declined very quickly. Part of the fault lies with the Socialist Party, who, as I said, made a pact agreeing to disarm if the fascists wouldn't turn. The Communist Party national leadership was against its members joining the Arditi del Popolo, although its units locally, they kind of fought alongside it, but without accepting its military discipline, partly because in the Communist Party it was kind of widely accepted that they should maintain their own sort of military hierarchy and so on. However, I think the problem really is that if you look at countries where there were mass workers' militias in the interwar period, they relied on, they weren't just created like from nothing by training up Communist Party recruits as soldiers or whatever. Also, of course, in the most notable examples, which are the Austrian and German ones, they actually had kind of protection from within state power. Because I said, like with the Cap Putsch and the far right uprising against the social democratic government, the national government called a general strike. It had massive support within the civil service, within institutions. The same was true to a lesser extent in Austria as well, where the Social Democrats controlled the Vienna government. Not the national government, but the city of Vienna. And I think that created conditions in which it was easier to form a big armed defense force. But even that wasn't really the same thing as fascists, because I mean the Italian fascists would just openly massacre their opponents. They killed thousands of people, and they enjoyed basically police connivance, except for a handful of incidents. So I think just the scale and the level of military preparation were vastly mismatched. I think that the Arditi del Popolo were interesting in the sense that they were able to recruit a lot of former veterans in a way which wasn't really true of the left parties. But they did fight some major battles against rising fascism. Particularly in Parma, in Bari, also in Rome, at points. But I mean, their fundamental problem was that if the state didn't defend itself, then all they could do was defend. They could defend working class neighborhoods, they could defend labor movement infrastructure, and so on. but the main institutions of the state didn't defend the state itself, so they couldn't really do it on its behalf, which is why it was kind of easily demobilized. Then the other question was yours, Kevin, which was about, oh yeah, how fascism is discussed today. I mean, I think the problem is that the there's a very strong trope in Italian public discourse the last 30 years, which is like, in the Cold War years, the communists had it all their own way, and anti-fascism became this kind of state dogma. Whereas now we can be honest and recognize there were lots of crimes on all sides. So lots of, so there's the main post-war neo-fascist party was called the MSI. And that essentially, or so eventually became Brothers of Italy, the party I mentioned. The Lega doesn't have fascist roots in the same way as Brothers of Italy. But basically lots of people who had been MSI personnel have been neo-fascists, like openly Mussolini nostalgic deep into the 80s. They then shifted to this line, which is like, well, of course, the Holocaust was bad and the alliance with Nazi Germany was a mistake, and the values of the resistance to German occupation are like the common inheritance of all Italians. But at the same time, we should recognize that the communists took part in the resistance to try and create a Stalinist dictatorship in Italy. So really what we need to do is oppose the extremists on all sides. So when a former fascist, Gianni Alemanno, was elected mayor of Rome in 2008, and you know, so even in 1994, this party became part of Berlusconi's coalition. And you know, Berlusconi himself sort of often would like joke about the regime and sort of trivialize its record. And when in 2008, Alemanno, a sort of former fascist, was elected mayor of Rome, when he was actually celebrating the victory sort of at the moment of the count, loads of fascists were like, you know, Roman saluting, so-called, you know, Nazi saluting, shouting fascist slogans and so on. And then he apologized to that, and he went to lay a wreath at the only synagogue in Rome. And when he was there, he said, we should condemn the crimes by all sides in the civil war, whether communists or Nazis. So kind of already in that, there's a shift in which the sort of prior anti-fascist assumption is just swept away. I mean, one of the key indicators of this is a thing called the foibe, which is foibe. It's a reference to like they're like wells, they're like natural like hollow spaces, like caves, along the northeastern Italian border with Yugoslavia. And basically, that's a reference to in the months following the armistice, Yugoslav partisans and maybe some Italian communists continued killing people, several thousand people, in fact, and supposedly dumped them in these caves. And so you have this huge offensive for the last 2 or 3 decades in Italy, where all we ever hear about is the foibe, the people who died in caves. And these are always presented as like innocent victims who, you know, were murdered by the bloodthirsty Yugoslav communists. And Berlusconi introduced like a national day of memory to remember them, the people who died. A couple of regions, I think it's Veneto and Friuli, like kind of northeastern regions, they've issued a law where it's a criminal offense to deny that 12,000 people were killed like this. And like all real historians deny that this is true. Like maybe like 3,000 people were killed, but like a lot of them were fascists. It was a lot more like fighting rather than just innocent people being slaughtered. And also this kind of sense of this line of Italian victimhood ignores the fact that 1 million people died when Germany and Italy invaded Yugoslavia in 1941 and occupied it for 3 years. And that is the reason why these killings took place. Now there's a motion in Parliament by Brothers of Italy, which will amend the penal code. Its specific reference to the fact that Holocaust denial is is like not protected free speech, and is in fact criminal. And basically the proposal is that it would become illegal to deny that 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust, or that 12,000 people were killed by Yugoslav partisans, with like no mention of like any other crime in history, the Italian occupation of Yugoslavia, Italy and Ethiopia, the crimes of fascist regime, or anything like this. I think it's really alarming how little pushback there is against this. Also because in Italy, you know, we have, well, I say we, I'm Italian, I lived there for years. So it's like, you know, there's a very strong, you know, like vein of like liberal ex-communist pundits and politicians endlessly self-flagellating, and we always have to apologize for this kind of thing. So I think it's a very dangerous idea that this idea, which is kind of like anti-fascism, is sort of has always silenced people, and now we can finally hear the truth. At the same time, I think it's also dangerous the way that anti-fascism is used very cynically by the sort of mainstream liberal centre-left, in order to just like demonize its opponents while demanding that its own voters turn out, in the sense that, you know, it's like if you don't give people any other reason to vote for you other than the far-right baddies at the door, eventually it becomes very exhausted, in particular because currently the government of Italy is a grand coalition uniting the Democrats, like liberals, ex-communists, the Five Star Movement, the Lega and Berlusconi's party, all in a government with like no democratic mandate. And I think the issue is that Italy over the last 3 decades, it's not just Italy, you can point to other countries as well, because you've had these, it's like the main bourgeois parties have very heavily worn down the sort of bases of like mass democratic politics and the kind of democratic rules that mainly exist through kind of how do you say, sort of precedent. So, you know, like in the last 30 years, I think now we're on our 5th technocratic government. We've had, you know, cabinets entirely made up of unelected officials, without any kind of democratic mandate. Then at the same time, you've had, you know, massive rolling back of labour protections, dramatically falling electoral turnout. We can see this in other countries too. I mean, if we look at France, you know, the regional elections on Sunday had a less than 1 in 3 turnout. So I think like there's a certain type of neoliberal governance, which is basically based on, you know, demobilizing the old kind of working class left, pushing down turnout, reducing the space of democratic choice. And I think all of those things kind of create the conditions in which, not that like a fascist regime is going to come about, or in which someone like Giorgia Meloni or Marine Le Pen is going to kind of like openly criticize democracy, but rather the kind of spaces of resistance and the obstacles to their takeover become a lot weaker.
Thanks, David. In a way, you've perhaps made a good summing up there. Pat's question has finally come through in text, and maybe we just might like to take this as a summing up question. Pat says, will the ruling class give power to a fascist movement after the disastrous experience of the Second World War? And the other question Pat asks is, he thinks that there aren't very many good accounts of this period in English, certainly written from the left, and he wondered if you could recommend anything. But I think if you just would respond to that, and then we'll take that as a summing up, David. You've worked very hard this evening.
No, so the first question was the failure to stop Mussolini. Is that right?
Sorry, no, the first question, the question here says, will the ruling class give power to the fascist movement after the disastrous experience?
Yeah. I mean, I think that I mean, I think that no movement is going to take power that is openly seeks a, you know, in the sense that, like, you know, the comrade earlier mentioned, you know, some Mein Kampf orders are openly laying out its kind of imperialist ambition, or like, you know, even in the period after World War in Italy, the kind of sense of D'Annunzio called the mutilated victory, like Italy hadn't got what it deserved. So I think that kind of open imperialist posturing is also like is neither likely to gain electoral support for a movement or to let it be taken seriously. But I think the China issue is interesting in that sense, in that compared to the five-star Lega government of a few years ago, which brought Italy into the Belt and Road Initiative and had relatively warm relations with Russia. Fratelli d'Italia is much more like Atlanticist and is very strongly anti-China, very into like promoting the kind of Wuhan lab type idea, you know, like the conspiracy theory about the creation of COVID-19, very into like sanctions on China, standing up for the Uyghurs in a totally demagogic and hypocritical way, given the party is blatantly Islamophobic and so on. So I think it's realistic to think that in countries which are not enjoying but are experiencing a decline on the world stage, becoming less important, and which have a overinflated sense of their place in the world and which are declining, of which Italy is an obvious example. I think that those kind of positions can both be very popular, including in terms of like allowing basically fascist movements to win over the most of the support of the right, and also in changing the stance of the European Union. I mean, I think like, I mean, the question was like, yeah, I don't think anyone who wants to like openly talk about revisiting the outcome of World War II is likely to be taken too seriously. But I think that the sort of afterlife of anti-communism and continuation of the Cold War certainly is allowing far-right or sort of post-fascist forces to merge with sort of more normal conservative parties. I attended a conference in March of 2020 called National Conservatism, organized by a guy called Yoram Hazony. He's like a big, he's like an Israeli Zionist. And he organized a conference with had loads of guys from like the GOP, the Republicans in the States, like, you know, Reagan speech writers, this kind of stuff, some British Tories, people from like sort of far right and far right adjacent media, like you know, Douglas Murray from The Spectator, Salvini was there, Giorgia Meloni was there, Viktor Orban was there and spoke, Marion Maréchal, Marine Le Pen's niece. So I think you have this fusion of like Eastern European anti-communist far-right parties who use their experience of the Eastern Bloc to confect an idea of victimhood and resistance to cultural Marxism and so on. I think the ideas of those kind of forces, and then also like these Southern European parties like Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy, or Vox in Spain, those kind of parties are joining forces with the mainstream centre-right. And I think that that's a very dangerous phenomenon. Then on stuff to read, I think so. I think a good. I mean, I think the best thing to read on the fascist takeover, also because it's not like, I mean, it's fairly kind of dense, but it's not like an academic book or whatever. It's like, and fairly nicely written and so on, is Adrian Littleton's book, The Seizure of Power. Then there's a book by Paul Corner called Fascism in Ferrara, which is very good on the takeover. Then trying to think on the takeover specifically, because I guess I would actually argue that I think that there really isn't anything good on the position of the communist and socialist parties, and there's a lot of kind of mythology about that, which seriously needs to be countered. I'm actually writing a book about Amedeo Bordiga and the origins of the Communist Party of Italy, which will be out in about 6 months' time. So that's certainly one to look out for. Then, I mean, I think also the works of Tom Behan, like Behan, are, and there's a book called The Resistible Rise of Benito Mussolini, which you know, is decent, but it's a bit kind of, I know there's kind of history, and then there's, oh no, and so the other thing that's really worth reading is there's a book called Proletarian Order by Gwyn Williams, which is about the Biennio Rosso, mainly the factory occupations movement of 1919 to 20. Then there's a book called The Occupation of the Factories by Paolo Spriano, which is about the same period, 1919 to 20. Yeah, I think that's the best stuff to read, really.
Okay, well, thanks very much, David, for an excellent opening. Really, you know, comprehensive, and raised some interesting questions. And likewise, I'd like to thank all the comrades who spoke and asked questions, or you know, sent them in. So thanks very much. Certainly, the questions you raised about contemporary fascism, I think, are going to you know, reoccur. And maybe the discussion you put forward on national conservatism might be a useful session at some stage. I'm sure that, you know, the topic's going to continue to be of interest. So I'd like to thank everybody, and I don't know if there are any further announcements. Tina, if you've got any further announcements you'd like to make before we finish this evening?
No, thanks.
Okay, okay, good. Well, next week we're going to look at the rise of Nazism in Germany, an interesting parallel, and we can certainly keep some of David's points in mind when we go over that. So once again, thank you, and good evening, comrades.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Okay, bye.
Yeah.